With the release of Dark Phoenix this weekend, 19 years of the Fox adaptations of the X-Men films come to a close. Now that they've been bought by Disney, the X-Men are going to be reintroduced sometime in the near future as a part of the MCU. So, a lot of people are saying the Dark Phoenix is terrible and it's the worst film in the entire franchise. But is it?
Wolverine! Tell Cyclops I made him a convertible.
Well, welcome back to the channel, guys. Thanks again for being patient with no video last week. I was sick. I'm still a little bit sick, so I apologize if I sound weird. I've just been chugging Dayquil and drinking juice and stuff. So, I will preface this by saying that as a result of my being sick and very busy at work, I have not yet watched Dark Phoenix. So right out of the bat, if you guys are looking for this to be a review of Dark Phoenix, it is not. I haven't seen it. I barely want to watch it. I will, but I haven't yet. But earlier this week, I started seeing the wave of reviews coming out for the film, calling it like the worst X-Men movie ever. And there have been a lot of these movies in the last 20 years, and some of them are really shitty. So I have a hard time believing that Dark Phoenix is like legitimately like the worst one, right? So I'm not going to do an entire like soup to nuts revisit the entire X-Men franchise. That'd be too long, and I don't really want to rewatch all those movies. But I do today want to talk about the three, what I consider to be the three worst films, and at the end of the video decide which one's like really the worst, barring actually seeing Dark Phoenix. For a bit of background, I am a lifelong X-Men fan. Love the X-Men, learned to read through X-Men comics. I remember when the 2000 X-Men film came out being incredibly disappointed, mostly because, I don't know, like 1998, the Blade movie came out, and that movie was fucking tight, and I just expected that, like, the X-Men movie would be similarly awesome, and it just wasn't. But it is responsible for kind of bursting the floodgates open and helping superhero films become what they were today. It kind of goes Blade 98, then X-Men in 2000, then Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in 2002, and then this fucking train has not stopped since. The thing about the X-Men films, however, is that even though I don't like all of them, or many of them to be entirely honest, I don't like what I've been seeing lately where a lot of MCU people are like, oh, well, once the MCU gets and Kevin Feige gets a hold of it, these movies are going to be awesome. And, like, maybe they'll be better. I hope they would be better. But the likelihood that they're actually going to be really good X-Men adaptations is, like, super nil, right? I just can see them sanding down the edges of what makes the X-Men special. Like, the X-Men aren't like Spider-Man. Like, Spider-Man comics are all kind of similarly good, you know? Like, I feel like what makes a good Spider-Man story is, like, kind of universal and simple and, like, not terribly hard to adapt. Ditto a lot of different superhero franchises, right? But what makes the X-Men special is that they're fucking weird. They're, like, ridiculous. It's an entire series that starts off being this very straightforward metaphor for, like, otherness and, like, race issues and things like that. And then over the course of, like, 50 years, it's just become a million other things. X-Men isn't just a metaphor for, like, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's, like, warring ideologies about race relations anymore, right? Like, it stopped being that a long time ago. It's about time travel. It's about soap opera. It's about just a million fucking things. More than anything else, the X-Men is about not entirely making sense. So it's kind of beautiful that over the years, Fox's ridiculous adaptations of the X-Men comics have gotten, like, weirder and stranger, in many cases worse, because that's what the comics do over the course of time. It reminds me of a meme I saw a couple of weeks ago about how, you know, essentially, if you really love the X-Men, then you have to like all X-Men things. You don't just get to show up for the Dark Phoenix saga and for Grant Morrison's run in the book. You have to read everything. You gotta sit through the Chuck Austen years of Uncanny. You gotta sit through the fucking Joseph saga. Remember when there was like a dude named Joseph that we all thought was Magneto, but it was a fucking clone of Magneto? Remember that shit? That aside, we're today gonna talk about three very shitty X-Men movies. Before you even ask, I'm just going to throw out my rankings right here of what I think are the definitive power rankings of the entire X franchise. Take a look at that for a second. You can disagree in the comments. Oh, there you already saw the three movies at the bottom, but those are the ones we're going to talk about. I think most people who've seen all the X-Men films tend to agree on one of these three films as being the worst in the entire franchise. For the longest time, I think most people agreed that X-Men The Last Stand was pretty terrible, but X-Men Origins Wolverine happened, and that's also really shitty and offensive in a lot of ways. But then recently, we got X-Men Apocalypse, which is garbage. Here's the thing about X-Men Origins Wolverine. I thought I'd never seen it before, which is a weird thing, right? Because you'd think I would have seen this film. And I'm like, no, I've never seen it. I looked on Letterboxd, I never logged it before, and I was like, okay, I guess I'm just going to watch it for the first time. Maybe I only have vague recollections of it from other people's disdainful opinions about it. Let's just see what happens. And the minute the movie started up, and I saw little James Howlett pop open his little bone claws to murder his dad, not dad, I realized I've totally fucking seen this movie. And then every subsequent scene, I was like, no, I've seen this movie. I knew every beat, I knew every character that showed up, every weird piece of casting. Why is will.i.am in this movie? And I was like, oh, okay, I have seen X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's odd that I don't remember it. Then, at the end of the film, when the credits hit, I fell asleep. I haven't been sleeping very much lately, and that makes sense, so I passed out, and I woke up, and I was like, oh, yeah, that was weird. Okay, well, I gotta log this on Letterboxd, because I'm a creature of habit. And I got to log it, and as I started typing, I was like, holy shit. I already don't remember anything in this movie. I've already forgotten a huge chunk of X-Men Origins Wolverine, and I just watched it like 45 minutes ago. And that begs the question, how many times have I watched X-Men Origins Wolverine? And why is my brain so good at protecting me from how shitty it is? It's a bad movie. It was destined to be a bad movie. The number one thing everyone understands, I think, about Wolverine is that he's a character who is best when you don't know every nook and cranny of his history. Paul Jenkins and Andy Kubert's comic Origin, with colors by Richard Eisenoff, I can't forget that because it's the only reason the book looks very good. It's a terrible book. It's a terrible comic. It's a horrible idea. No one needed to know Wolverine's origin, and if we were going to be told it, it didn't need to be this story. It's rough. And I think they made a sequel. So to turn that into like a movie is bad, but they get props for truncating that entire story in just the opening like segment before the big like multiple war spanning opening credits thing or whatever. Good things the movie has going for it. Liev Schreiber is great as Sabretooth, who's like a nothing character, but he has a lot of fun with it. People give the movie a hard time for its treatment of Deadpool, but like up until the whole sequence at the end, Ryan Reynolds is a pretty great Wade Wilson in his scenes. Like it's the same performance he has in the Deadpool movies. He's just not wearing a mask. I don't see what the big deal is. And like Hugh Jackman's decent in it. Danny Houston seems like he's having a good time playing the villain. It's not like the worst movie action-wise, I guess. Some of the action's okay. Again, I don't know why will.i.am's in it. Like, it feels too slight to call it the worst X-Men movie. It's really shitty. It's not good. We got the Wolverine later, and then we also got, Logan and stuff. So, like, most people were vindicated with their thirst for, like, a Wolverine-centric movie, even though almost all these movies are Wolverine-centric in one way or the other. But to me, I don't think X-Men Origins Wolverine is terrible enough to call it the worst X-Men movie. It just... It's like bad. It's like bad, but it's like kind of regular bad. It's bad the way a lot of superhero movies used to be and sometimes still are. It doesn't feel like spectacular in its awfulness, Like, I mean, I've already forgotten most of it. That's pretty safe, you know what I mean? I feel like for a movie to be really bad, it's gotta like stick with you and like eat at you and like gnaw at your soul. Clearly, over the course of the last 10 years, I've seen this movie several times, and I remember most of that ever happening, you know what I mean? So like, it's safe as far as I'm concerned. One of the worst, but not the worst. That brings us to X-Men The Last Stand. Arguably the worst X-Men movie ever, right? A lot of things going against it. Thing one, it's written by Simon Kinberg and Zach Penn. Simon Kinberg is basically a screenwriter who was involved in X3 and then ended up being involved in all of these movies going forward. I think before this he'd written Jumper. I think it's the only thing he did, and then he became kind of a bigger like writer producer in Hollywood all the way up until now, where he wrote, directed, produced, and he didn't star. Where was I going with that? He doesn't star in Dark Phoenix. He maybe has a cameo, but whatever. He directed Dark Phoenix, and this guy's sort of been like as much of the shepherd of the X franchise as Bryan Singer, oddly enough. Anyway, though, those guys are like not very good writers, so like right off the bat, you knew it wasn't going to be great, right? Then, on top of that, it's directed by Brett Ratner. Bryan Singer had left Fox to go do the Superman Returns movie, which like doesn't really hold up, but like has some nice moments. Like I'll give it that. And they brought in Brett Ratner to do the X-Men instead. And Brett Ratner has like never made a really good movie, and he's like a piece of shit. The Rush Hour movies are fun. I guess those count, but I feel like I don't know. I feel like a capuchin monkey with a camera could have made those good because it's Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan. Like, really can't fuck that up. But every movie he's made has just been like hot garbage. Like Ed Norton and him got into fights in the set of Red Dragon. Like the guy sucks. And here he is directing an X-Men movie, directing like the end of a trilogy X-Men movie. It's supposed to be this big, The Last Stand. It's like this big deal. And we knew from X2 that they were seeding the Dark Phoenix saga to be a future film, and this is the movie. But it doesn't work, obviously. And clearly it doesn't sound like it works in the new Dark Phoenix story either, which Kinberg also made as like an apology for this movie. But rewatching this movie yesterday, I realized that I still hate it. It's still trash. But it's not that bad either, okay? I think what's weird about The Last Stand is, like, watching it, I don't like it. I think it's not a good movie, and I think there's a lot of things that are super shitty about it. But it seems like it's doomed to be a shitty movie from like the start. So I don't feel bad that it turned out to be right. That's how I feel about the movie. When I watch it, like, because the movie opens up with Magneto and Xavier going to visit Jean Grey for the first time when she's a child. And this is, like, years ago, so the de-aging CGI process isn't what it is now in movies, like in Scorsese's The Irishman or in Captain Marvel and stuff. This is, like, the dawn of people using that technique. And Patrick Stewart just looks weird and jerky, and, like, Ian McKellen looks like he's wearing a mask. It's rough. But, like, it kind of lets you know everything you need to know about this era of the X-Men films. Like, it's got two of the greatest actors, like, of all time, playing two of the greatest comic characters of all time, doing a fantastic job, in a movie that doesn't make a lot of sense, and shoehorns in too many things, and has too many characters, and has too many, like, warring plot pieces, and parts of it are good, and, like, most of it's shitty. Like, that's kind of what those movies are like. To me, the first X-Men movie is actually a pretty solid film, and if you're not a huge fan of the X-Men, the movie works better. X2 was, like, closer to being good. There's a lot of things I still really like in it, even though there's stuff I think is stupid. It's, like, you know, like, the closest it comes to feeling, like, right. But X-Men The Last Stand, it just kind of reminds you, like, okay, if you take away even, like, a modicum of Bryan Singer's talent, you end up with Brett Ratner. He's not that much worse than Singer, but he's just worse enough to make you realize, like, oh, these weren't that great to begin with, right? And that's the thing about X-Men The Last Stand. The main reason it doesn't work is actually one of the key components of why a lot of X-Men movies don't work. Many of them try so hard to fit so many different things from different pieces of the source material that as a movie, it just doesn't work. X2 survives because it's basically just taking stuff from God Loves, Man Kills, and then, like, a little bit of, like, the Weapon X shit, and, like, making that a movie. When you watch X3, it's like, let's take the Dark Phoenix saga, kinda. Let's take a bunch of stuff from Joss Whedon's, like, Gifted story arc, kinda. And then let's just fill the periphery with, like, other shit. Let's just pretend this is, like, this big final chapter in a trilogy. One thing X-Men The Last Stand has going for it that I'm pretty certain Dark Phoenix does not is that by the time we get to this movie, all of the characters in the movie we actually have spent a significant amount of time with over the past two films. So when they try to make things, like, epic and final and a big deal, like, you actually do know who they are. Like, you get Iceman and, like, that fire guy. Pyro? It's the dude from Tadpole, Aaron, whatever. Like, you get why those guys have a rivalry. You get the weird love triangle between Iceman, Rogue, and Kitty Pryde. Like, you don't know why Vinnie Jones is the Juggernaut, but, like, he is. Like, all the things, for the most part, kind of, like, function together. Not well, not in a way that's impressive or exciting or engaging, but, like, it kind of, it makes enough sense. My biggest beef with it is just that, you know, the movie positions Wolverine and Storm as kind of like the two leads as the story progresses, and, like, Hugh Jackman's more than up to the task. Obviously, we've never not had him be the lead in these movies, but Halle Berry's Storm is terrible, and it's not Halle Berry's fault. It's definitely partly the hairstylist in those films' fault, but it's not her fault. She's a very talented actress. I wouldn't have cast her as Storm in a million years, but, like, she could be good as Storm in, like, a good movie. It's just most of these movies aren't very good. And the story is just too muddled. There's too many things happening. The idea of using the Cure from the comics as, like, a thing to make your movie around could be okay if you didn't also have the looming specter of Famke Janssen's Jean Grey being the Dark Phoenix, and whatever the fuck that even means in the context of these movies. And it's just frustrating. There's just too many things going on. These writers and Brett Ratner's director are not smart or interesting or progressive enough to work with the underlying metaphors of X-Men comics at all. Like, it's just a bunch of weird, dumb white dudes, like, trying to say important things about, like, otherness, and, like, they just have no fucking... Like, at the very least, Bryan Singer is gay, and, like, sort of use that as his entry point into, like, why he connected to the X-Men. I don't know what Brett Ratner's entry point to the X-Men is, necessarily, so, it really shows through. It feels hollow. It feels like just kind of whatever. I almost feel like the way they treat being a mutant in the movie is more like the way vampires are treated in vampire movies. And obviously there are ways you can attack a vampire story that could have the same complexity as what good X-Men stories have, but, like, I mean, like, bargain bin shitty vampire stories, and that's kind of saying something. But, again, as much as I think X-Men The Last Stand is really shitty, I don't think it's actually the worst. If we're going to talk about the worst, we've got to talk about X-Men Apocalypse. Now, I know some people will think this one can't be the worst because Bryan Singer directed it, and he directed all the good ones, right? Not true. Bryan Singer did direct the first two X-Men movies, and those tend to be the most beloved from regular people. But for my money, as you've seen from my rankings earlier, I think that the two best X-Men movies are probably Days of Future Past, which Singer did direct, and First Class, which he did not, directed by Matthew Vaughn. And both of those films share a lot of DNA because Vaughn was going to originally direct Days of Future Past before leaving to make the Kingsman series. And what makes those movies work is that Days of Future Past obviously heavily uses stuff from the Days of Future Past story arc from the 80s, but First Class kind of feels like its own thing. It's a bunch of piecemeal stuff from the Magneto movie that never got made and some other things. It kind of turns the X-Men franchise into a Bond film with the period piece setting and the glow popping and stuff and the weird cast. On paper, First Class should be a terrible X-Men movie. But I remember when I first watched it, I thought that it felt a lot closer to what I like about the X-Men than any of the Singer films. And one of the things I like the most about Days of Future Past is not the Singer parts. It's the stuff that kind of carried over from the Vaughn version. So to me, the fact that Bryan Singer ended up getting the reins back at this point in the franchise is, I think, where things went wrong. I personally believe that if Matthew Vaughn had stuck around with the franchise after First Class and done Days of Future Past and maybe stuck around to the point of doing Apocalypse, the franchise could have gotten good again. That's what I personally believe. I think the actual best thing in the X-Men franchise is the weird little offshoot movies. I think stuff like Deadpool and Logan is what makes the franchise special, that they can do weird esoteric things on the periphery like the actual X-Men comics, and they don't have to be beholden to one singular house style. But I think the second best thing about the franchise is this era, the James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, and yes, Jennifer Lawrence era of the X-Men. I think that Fassbender and McAvoy are fucking incredible as Xavier and Magneto. And I think Jennifer Lawrence is underrated as Mystique. I know it's weird that she got kind of recast into this underdog hero role, that the character was never written in that way that much in the comics, and I know a lot of people don't like Jennifer Lawrence and she can be really annoying, but I do think that she brings something to these movies, and I think it's kind of unfair to ignore that. Apocalypse is very clearly the point where everyone involved no longer wants to be in the movie. In The Last Stand, it's clear that it's the end of this shit and some of these people aren't going to come back anymore, but they don't seem exhausted. They were in two successful movies, now the third one's kind of a mess. In Apocalypse, everyone involved looks like they want to fucking die. Even the people that just got there. Even Ty Sheridan and Sophie Turner and all them, they already seem over being in this universe, and they just showed up. Michael Fassbender looks like he had no idea he was signing on for this many projects. James McAvoy's still trying his hardest. I mean, he's been in worse movies. And Jennifer Lawrence just looks spent. Homegirl just looks fucking done. The biggest thing that's wrong with these movies at this point is that First Class took place in the 60s, and the Days of Future Past took place in the 70s, and Apocalypse was to take place in the 80s, which means 25 years have passed, and Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy and Jennifer Lawrence have not aged at all. Nicholas Hoult hasn't aged either. And everyone else in the movie is supposed to be young, and it's the characters we know from the 2000s films in the 80s, which is kind of odd. And that whole sliding timeline thing doesn't make any sense, and neither does a lot of the changes to continuity from Days of Future Past time travel. A lot of things don't make sense about these movies, but that's kind of the X-Men. A lot of things about the X-Men don't make sense. Just look up Cable's Wikipedia entry, then come back and tell me these things were ever intended to make sense. But at this point, setting it in the 80s is a gimmick. They don't really do anything with the concept of the 80s where it would make sense. It's not like they tied it into the imagery of the Cuban Missile Crisis like they did in First Class, right? Or some of the civil unrest in the 70s and stuff that they did in Days of Future Past. It's just the 80s, so everyone dresses that way. They talk about going to the mall, and that's it. And the entire story is based around Apocalypse, one of my least favorite X-Men villains there is. And they have Oscar Isaac, one of the most talented actors of his generation, looking like Ivan Ooze from the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, which is a fucking disgrace. And everyone involved is still trying. It's obvious that they don't care anymore, they don't want to be involved in this process, but they're doing their best. And there is still the potential for this to be a good movie. That, to me, is what makes it the worst. When Last Stand starts up, you know this is going to suck. Ditto with X-Men vs. Wolverine. From jump, you know this isn't going to work. I remember watching X-Men Apocalypse and kind of thinking they were going to pull it together because some of the themes are interesting. The idea that mutants don't have, a god, so to speak. They don't look at the Christian concept of God as being their God because they are some kind of genetic mistake that he didn't intend to create. The idea that Apocalypse, actually walking among them, treats himself like their deity, and that he's there for them, even though he's like a crazy conqueror type, is fascinating. And because Oscar Isaac and Michael Fassbender are two incredible actors, even though there's like a shitty script and like kind of bad direction and ugly CGI and weird makeup, in their scenes together, they tricked me for a little bit into thinking this was going to be a good movie. Like, some of their stuff, I was like, I like this idea. Magneto feels like forsaken. He's tried to be a good person. He's tried to live under Charles's dream. And now his family's dead and stuff. And here's, like, literal mutant God showing up to tell him, like, no, we're going to do this together. You were always right. We got to kill them and take over Earth and stuff. Like, I thought that stuff was pretty powerful. I don't know, maybe other people would make fun of me for thinking that, but I really like that stuff. It's just that everything else around it is just like, whatever. Like, who cares? The weird, like, fake romantic comedy shit between Xavier and Moira is stupid. Just everything about everything else in it. Like, trying to introduce these new, technically not new, but, like, the younger versions of the characters we knew from the other movies. Like, what's-her-face is Storm. She's fucking terrible. The idea that, like, in X-Men The Last Stand, Angel is introduced as like a teenager in like the 2000s, but here he shows up as a grown-ass adult in the 80s. Like, what time travel thing could they have done to make him be born earlier and punk? The fact that like Jubilee shows up in the movie, even though she's like definitely like a 90s looking character, but she's just in the 80s and we're pretending that she fits. The fact that like they do a bunch of weird psychic battle stuff between Xavier and Apocalypse that heavily uses imagery from every time Xavier's ever fought the Shadow King. Like, why didn't they just use the fucking Shadow King, right? Well, I know the Shadow King's being used in Legion, but the fact that, like, they're obviously, again, seeding this fucking Jean Grey Dark Phoenix bullshit, even though you know there's just no way they're gonna pull it off. It's just too many things. Apocalypse is just too large and big a villain to fit into this particular canvas. A guy who should be so big and epic that he is like difficult to behold, instead is like a weird shrunken purple man walking around with a funny accent. And there's a long prologue that just looks like it's from The Mummy, but shitty because The Mummy's dope and this isn't. It's a mistake. It's the movie more so than any other film in the franchise that burns to the ground the concept that the main part of the franchise can never be good again. It's the movie that lets us know that we should only pay attention to like the FX TV series or Deadpool or whatever they let Hugh Jackman do on the side. Like, that the actual core main team stuff is just going to be trash until Disney buys it, and then maybe it will be a different kind of trash. It's a tragedy. So yeah, that's what I think. I think Apocalypse is actually the dirt worst X-Men movie ever. Until we see Dark Phoenix, and I don't know. Is it possible that Dark Phoenix could be even worse than Apocalypse? I don't know. I haven't seen it. I'm going to try to find time to this weekend. If you guys have seen it and you do think it's worse than the Apocalypse movie, tell me why in the comments. And we'll be back next week with something else, now that I'm not sick anymore, back to the regular schedule. So if you guys like this video, please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. Hit the little bell icon so you get notifications. And we'll be back next week with more talk about movies.